Hello and welcome to Pods Like Us. I'm Martin Quibell, known to my friends as Marv. This time I am speaking with Paisley, who does a show that is really fascinating. So if you think about learning a language, sometimes it can be really difficult because it's a bit like if you're learning music, you learn all the theory and that can bore people. But keeping that analogy, learning a language through listening to music could be more interesting because you, in some ways, learn words easier through songs than you do through a classroom. Anyway, thank you for speaking with me today, Paisley. I hope you're okay.
Oh, thank you for having me. I really appreciate the invitation.
That's fine. So, my introduction, is that what you were thinking when you started the show?
Um, I'm not sure that I was really thinking anything when I started the show, except that I was bored and needed a hobby. Um, um, but one thing I've always done in the course of my language learning, and even before I actually got into a classroom, is learn and translate songs. Used to start with the simplest songs I could find in the beginning, but it always helped me along, and it always helped sort of cement not only the vocabulary I was learning, but also give me more of an ear for grammar, more of an ear for sentence structure, and also more of an ear for the language itself. And it's just always been very helpful to me, and obviously a lot more fun than plowing through a textbook. So I kind of starts from there, I guess, and then I've sort of just experimented with different things, trying to make it a little more interesting, like adding a cultural and historical component to the show that tends to be related to the song in some way. So yeah, just something that was kind of to be honest, a spur of the moment idea that I thought I'd try out. And I thought I'd probably give up after an episode or two because no one would want to listen. And it has not turned out that way. And yeah, starting season 2, we just started my second season of the show.
Wow. Well done.
Thank you.
It's it's interesting looking at another language because I mean with German you've got various different various different ways of saying specific words. For instance, it's a bit like so in English you'll have one word for the or whatever, and then in German you have the masculine, the feminine, and the neuter. So that's an interesting way of looking at it. Like you said, it makes you look at language from a different perspective in a way, with that way of looking at things, but also with the way that how they structure sentences in a different language as well, where they will switch, where things will be in a different order. It's like that makes you think of the way that language is constructed as well, and can make things more interesting in a way. And it makes your brain work as well in a lot of ways when you're learning a language like that as well.
Yeah, definitely. I think one of the specific ways in which German is challenging for a lot of people is especially the Trennbares Verben, the separable verbs, where part of the verb is at the beginning of the sentence and part of it will be at the end. This also happens with some forms of the past tense, where they will kind of clue you in that you're about to have a past tense verb thrown at you eventually in the sentence. They'll clue you in towards the beginning, but then there could be 50 words between that and the end of the sentence where you get the verb and it completes the thought. And that can be very challenging, I think, especially for English speakers, because we don't have that. So it's sort of, you kind of have to retrain your brain to speak in those particular sentence patterns. We're not used to kind of trying to hang on to that thought that long. So yeah, it's definitely a very different way of speaking, and that takes a great deal of getting used to. And I mean, that's another thing, that just listening to native speakers speaking naturally, not just necessarily, the kind of curated sentences you get on, say, anybody who's ever sat in a language lab and just listened to somebody reading off sentences. That's very different than natural speech. So yeah, I think in that way, especially, and movies and TV shows and watching news articles, reading books, all of that's very, very good. But, as just as a music fan, I find that it's one of the ways that I like to engage with language the most.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, some bits of German I would have thought would have been relatively simple. In some words, for instance, would
Mhm.
be relatively easy for some English speakers to learn, because the fascinating thing that I'm not sure so many people know about is the fact that the English language, as it's called, is an amalgamation of different languages, and that anyway, because it comes from, you got the original from the old English, and then you've got German words that have been brought into the English language and melded into there. Same as you have the Norman, the French as well. That's been brought into the English as well. So really, English is an amalgam of all these different languages, and so you would have thought that that side would be easy, but like you said, the way that the sentences are constructed, that is one of the most difficult things, I think, like you said.
Yeah, yeah, I definitely agree. And some vocabulary definitely is very similar to English, and that is, one advantage to English speakers learning German, because English is actually a Germanic language. It falls under not Romance languages, although we have a lot of French in there and a lot of influence from Latin, but our, sort of, I guess, the base of the language is Germanic, with a great deal of influence from France and other regions.
Yeah, I think what ended up happening was that, so I think, like you said, a lot of Germanic was thrown in there, and some of the romanticized languages as well. But I think it kept the sentence and the way that people structure in English their sentences and the paragraphs, etc., is based around how people spoke in Old English. So I think there's still that way of constructing sentences and speaking that has been kept, but with these words that have come elsewhere to replace words that really didn't work. So these words that are from other languages originally have stuck and replaced words that have now gone away into history.
Yeah.
So what was your introduction to the German language in the first place? Was it something that you learned at school, or was it something that you learned some other way?
Actually, I was a toddler and lived in Germany because my father is actually a German professor, and he received a Fulbright scholarship to teach in Germany. And so my introduction to German was actually in Germany.
Yeah.
Some of my first words were German words. Now, mind you, I forgot them all once we returned to the United States, and it was a long time before I ever took a specific interest in the language, in learning the language. But just because of, my father, it was always around the house. Even when we returned home, he'd always be studying by listening to news reports all the time, watching any videos he could get his hands on. This was long before the internet, of course.
Yeah.
So it was just something that I've always been around. But again, with music, it was really German music that sparked my interest in actually learning the language. Because, I used to have some vague interest in knowing a couple of words, but I didn't particularly become interested until I was in high school. And when I was introduced to the band Einstürzende Neubauten, that is really when I started to think, this language is kind of cool. I'd like to know what they're saying in these songs. And then when I started translating it and just kind of learning how the language worked and seeing what I think is the poetry and the beauty in the language, that's where I just thought, okay, yeah, I really need to go into this more. And I ended up taking it in college and just loving it so much that it became my major.
Should I respond with "Das ist very gut"?
Danke.
So, I mean, that's a fascinating way of going into it. But then to go back to something almost that we were speaking about before we started the show, my brother, as I said, he taught in Japan, and he actually learnt Japanese or started to learn Japanese through watching Japanese anime and cartoons as a kid.
Yes.
So like Pokemon. So it's a strange thing for me to see because I'm terrible at languages. Surprisingly, even though I've just spoken German, but I'm terrible with languages for the most part. But it's strange to see someone who can just learn a language through that medium. In a way, they just pick up these words and from a program like Pokemon and those sort of things, I think, how can he understand what that word means? How does your brain get around and understand these words?
Well, it's context. As a anime fan myself, even I know a few Japanese words just from watching anime. Yeah, I mean it's context. You can't help but notice some words, I guess. That may not necessarily be true for all people. I suppose some people might just tune it out. But even if it's a language I'm not particularly interested in learning, I tend to actually focus in on it and listen whenever I'm watching, say, a foreign film, or even if I'm just overhearing a conversation between people. I'm always trying to pick out words. I guess just out of curiosity and fascination in general with languages. I think a lot of languages are just beautiful and fascinating. And I find it so interesting that they even exist, that there's such a plethora of languages on this earth. So yeah, I mean, and again, that brings you back to sort of songs. You pick up some things just through context.
I mean, I agree with you. I like the fact that there's all these different languages. It's a bit like I think there was a fear at one point in the US where people were saying that there was a potential for losing the original Native American languages, like the Cherokee and all these other languages that there were,
Mhm.
which I think is important that these languages are still there essentially and that people still speak them because there's something, as much as it's good that all these different people from different countries, because English is spoken by so many people in the world to different levels, but people can speak in that language. There's a good thing about that, but it's something different about having these different languages that have their own sort of I don't know how to explain it. I don't know if you can help me with trying to say what I'm trying to say. I don't know.
I'm not really sure where you're going. Although when in speaking of, you know, I'd say early history, there was an active attempt to exterminate those languages in America. If you look at our history and the way they used to sort of take native children from their families and try to enforce this standard of Europeanness and whiteness upon them. And part of that was actively preventing them from speaking their languages. I know Welsh language encountered something similar. Um, and so it is important for people who remain from these cultures to try to keep their languages alive. I think a couple of years ago they actually did a Navajo, not subtitling but dubbing of the Star Wars films and aired those in theaters, which I think is lovely that people are trying to hang on to these dying languages, which I mean, I think it's sad, but at the same time, I mean, in these cases, I think it's very sad because somebody's actively tried to exterminate the language. But on the flip side of that, just through natural course of history and immigration and the movement and migration of people, like we were talking about a minute ago with German and French influencing English, sometimes it is just kind of natural that older languages die out. There was Middle High German, that's no longer spoken, that no longer exists. There's just Hochdeutsch. There's no longer Middle English or Old English. And it is interesting to look at those texts and to kind of try to preserve them. But on that side of the coin, it is natural for some languages just to fall out of use altogether. Is that anywhere near what you were trying to get at?
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
Plus, I think that it's important that these languages are remembered as well, because I think it's important for the history. Because I think everything in history is important, and it helps if you look back to, as much as people like the idea of there's this saying that you always look to the future and never look back. I think it's good sometimes to look back at these things to remind people of where we came from, and there's good things in the past as well as bad things. But I think, I think language, but there's also a thing with language where I think language expresses how that culture is as well. It's another part of the culture as well as how they live. Their language speaks to how they are. So if you listen to French language, it's sort of a romantic language. Might be going a bit stereotyping here, but so if you go to France to one, to Nice or somewhere like that, there's almost like a calm and a relaxedness to there that matches the language that is with them as well.
Yeah. I think that's a fair way to look at it. I think, language and culture are not separable.
I also think that with when we were saying earlier on about the way that sentences and the diction of German and how that's structured, it's because so they don't rush so much how they speak. They try to construct it in a certain way, and that sort of like matches how they are, where they are not, they are sort of, they have the same sort of thing where they're almost more, because I mean, I lived in Germany for a few years when I was a kid, and there was a certain sort of like flow. I don't know whether it's changed since the early 70s. I'll quickly say that when I was a child. So it might have changed since then. But when I was there then, there was almost like a we'll get there when we get there sort of feel to it. It's like we're not going to rush this. We'll just have this moment and it'll last as long as it needs to last.
Right. Yeah, fair enough. I think you have to kind of get into regional dialects to see some of the looseness of the language sometimes.
Yep.
It can be a lot more loose, and I mean, when you speak in Hochdeutsch and listen to a lot of German, especially news broadcast, it's very, very clearly enunciated. Every word sort of is very, separate. Nothing really runs together. I guess that is another advantage for language learners. A lot of the content out there is very clear, very deutlich, as they say in German.
Yeah.
But when you kind of are in the country and you're like, one of the times I returned to Germany, I studied in Bavaria, and Bavarian is very different. And recently was in Berlin, and even Berlin has its own kind of dialect, which is a lot looser and a lot more difficult for me to pick up on. Um, so it does exist that, there's a much more kind of, not even sure how to describe it, loose, I guess,
Yeah.
not so rigid and structured as one sort of typically thinks of German language. It is out there, but I think you really have to kind of be in country to experience it.
Well, what you're saying there reminds me of when I started doing this show and I was speaking with people from America. I actually found that when I started doing this show, because you will know from being in the UK for a certain period of time, there are different localisms in different areas of the UK
Right.
and different dialects, essentially, and slang that's used. And I found myself saying things that I would say in normal conversation with people from the area that I'm in the Midlands, in the middle of
Mm.
the UK, middle of England. And then I was saying these things because it's a part of me to these American people and people in other countries as well. And they were sort of saying to me, well, I'm sorry, but what did you just say?
Right,
And
right.
so I found myself over that time almost changing the way that I speak for the show, because essentially I'm trying to make sure that people can understand what I'm saying. And that's a big change in a way, but I think I've got used to it now.
I can understand that code switching you have to do being from the South. The way I would speak with the way I speak when I'm back home in the South is a little different than I speak here where I live now. I live in the Pacific Northwest, and I'm one of those people who says y'all, and I'll say it unapologetically.
Yep.
But that definitely drops off when I'm, like here. I don't use it nearly as much. Um, just it's not that people wouldn't understand, it's just it's not the cultural norm, and people in general don't want to stick out like a sore thumb, so I drop a lot of things and a lot of references, a lot of ways of saying things that I would back home that people would readily understand, because people up here would either not necessarily understand it or they just kind of like, comment on it in some way or another. So yeah, absolutely understand that.
So, what was your first introduction to the world of podcast,
Do you mean in terms
of
uh
listening, and
listening?
how did you come across podcast in the first place?
To be honest, I've never really been a podcast person. That certainly changed over the past year because I've met a lot of really awesome podcasters. I know you know some of the same people, and
Yeah.
some people have some wonderful shows out there. But really, my introduction to podcast was NPR, National Public Radio
Yeah.
here. Um, they actually have a lot of content that is podcast related. And the first podcast that I really fell in love with and started listening to on a regular basis, and it still runs on NPR nationwide, pretty much nationwide. Snap Judgment by Glenn Washington. I don't know if you're familiar with it at all.
I have heard of that. Yep.
Okay. Wonderful podcast. It's all true or quote unquote true stories. He does two different podcasts. He does Snap Judgment, and he also is involved in Spooked, which, and I adore Spooked as well. Spooked is scary stories that are ostensibly real. And it usually comes around every year around Halloween. So basically, true ghost stories. Snap Judgment, however, is just true stories that are often rather amazing. Um, Very interesting. The one I listened to most recently, I've been listening to the show for years. Anybody who has listened to it for years knows that Glenn Washington grew up in a white supremacist cult. He is African American, his whole family is. But he grew up as part of this weird religious cult that also has a lot of white supremacist leanings. And he mentions that frequently, but it was only last year that he ever actually did a full episode on it, where you kind of learn the whole backstory and how his family came to this particularly weird cult. Um, and it is an incredible story. I absolutely recommend anybody to listen to this podcast, because that story and just every story by every individual who's ever been on it is just it will make you think, it'll blow your mind. It's just fascinating. And yeah, that's where I kind of started with podcast. And then until I started my own, I didn't really listen to much else. I listened to the Well Read podcast, which is a comedy podcast. It's a comedy group out of Tennessee. Um, they call themselves the liberal rednecks, which is basically what they are. They are very left leaning politically, but they also are, good old boys from the South.
Yep.
Yeah, they're fascinating as well. But yeah, I definitely see that I was missing out on a lot of great content out there, and I've certainly broadened my intake of podcast over the past year for sure.
So, what made you decide to actually decide to go into the world of podcasting and make your own show?
To be honest, I just heard an ad on the radio. Anchor,
Yep.
the podcast hosting site, somehow has been purchased by Spotify.
Yep.
Although they kind of consider themselves separate entities. And what Spotify allows Anchor users to do is actually insert songs directly from Spotify into your podcast.
Yep.
So anybody who listens to my podcast, when the songs come on, you're actually listening to the track that you would, listen to on Spotify normally.
Yep.
It's the track that the labels upload. I don't upload those. And I just thought, I'm this very weird person with a very specific taste in music. And I don't know a lot of people here who actually know a lot of the bands that I like. A few people know a few things. I've run into people in the wild who might know, like, band number 1, band number 3, but not a lot of people I can talk to about this thing that I'm really fascinated with and that I really love. So I'm just like, oh, yay, an outlet for talking about something that really interests me that I don't otherwise get an opportunity to talk about. Yeah, that's basically how it started.
Yeah, it's a bit like I did a Christmas related show. I don't know whether you caught that one, where somebody goes through Christmas music that's from Japan. And
I have
and
not
so,
caught that one.
and oh, that's a fascinating. What's that one called?
Yeah, tell me which one that's called, because I've listened to a handful, but not that one.
Holly Jolly Xmasu.
Okay, I will look it
Okay.
up.
So I'll remember to send you a link. I'll write that down.
Yeah, please do, because I think that would be that sounds like an interesting episode. Absolutely.
And trust my pen to stop working at this moment. I've got the most of that down anyway, so I know what I'm doing. But so he'd started that because he was just fascinated with that world, and very few people that he knew anything about that. Obviously, with him coming from America, so there's a bit of that. And then I posted up on my own feed about, because I'm a big fan of Yellow Magic Orchestra from Japan with
Yep.
Ryuko Sakamoto.
Ryuichi Sakamoto, I absolutely
Yes,
love him. Yeah, he was
so do
involved
I.
in the band Japan as well. Are you a fan of that band?
I'm a big
David
fan
Sylvian's
of
Japan.
Japan. Yes, yes, and
Ah,
Richard Barbieri and what's his name? Khan, Mick Khan.
nice. So have you seen the movie Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence?
I haven't, but I love the soundtrack.
Because that stars Ryuichi Sakamoto and David Bowie.
Well, he's the composer of the soundtrack of the music
Mm-hmm.
on it as
Yep.
well.
Yep.
Breaking,
And
but
Tom
yes,
Conti is in that movie as well. It's not a greatly known movie, but it's fantastic. Watch it if you can.
well, so on when I was chatting with the host of Holly Jolly Xmasu, he was saying about that. You know, you've sent me on a tangent here. So
Sorry.
he was saying about that to the Japanese, they are so used to the music, the main theme to Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence,
Mm,
that to them it's played in shopping malls over the Christmas period. So to them, it's everywhere. So they find it strange when he explains that it's a really very rarely known Christmas tune anywhere else, and they just find that strange that it's always played there, but it's little known elsewhere. But yeah, the drummer of Yellow Magic Orchestra died at the weekend, so I posted something about that.
oh no.
So
Okay.
I'm a fan of them. I mean German bands. I'm a huge fan of Kraftwerk and some other bands from Germany as well. But then again, saying that, I feel like saying that I'm a fan of Kraftwerk, that I've almost got into that cliche of that's the band that everybody picks up on from Germany, a bit like metal fans will pick up on Ramstein.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And that's what I find here too. Most of the time, if I'm like run into somebody who has any interest in German music, 9 times out of 10, it's they like Rammstein, they like Einstürzende Neubauten, which was basically my generation's Rammstein, and Kraftwerk, also same generation. Um, Lately, I run into people who like Wir sind Helden. That's a one that seems to kind of be a little more known here for whatever reason. I think a lot of people get introduced. If it's not someone like Rammstein who has somehow managed to break through the whole language barrier and become big here, it's something somebody's randomly heard because their professor in their German classroom decided to teach a song that day. So that's where a lot of people, run across. There's a rapper called Zito that a lot of people seem to have heard of
Yeah.
for one reason or another. And Wir sind Helden, they're kind of like a pop punk, I guess. They seem to be known somehow, but yeah, other than that, a lot of what I like is relatively unknown over here.
But that's the best thing about these shows, though. I mean, I've always said that one of the greatest things. I'm not going to say the definitive, but one of the greatest things about podcasting is that you can actually pick up on these little areas that are like, as I was saying, it's pronounced in England niche, or niche in America.
Mm-hmm.
It's pronounced, but you
I say
catch
niche.
you catch. Well, that's from the original French niche. That is a very niche subject, but you've got that audience out there that is now being catered for that
Mm-hmm.
weren't being catered for before. Because I think you were hinting earlier that you put your show out and you were surprised by how many people are listening to your show, and that's the fact. That's the true. That's a sign of that straight away, is that you have this show that people were obviously looking for, and you found what that audience wanted that they weren't getting anywhere else.
I'm so glad I could. Yeah, I've been coming up on 4,000 plays, and that's with being limited to only Spotify for distribution.
Yeah.
And that's after a year. I mean, it's absolutely blown me away. And, I can't thank people enough for actually listening. Because as I said, especially when I first started, when I put the first episode out, I think I got 2 listens for the first several weeks. And I'm like, I'll do another episode or two and then I'll just hang this up. But then out of nowhere, people actually started listening. And I did, in the analytics, you can look and see which countries and cities and states people are listening from. And it wasn't just here in the United States, literally all over the world. Some of the earliest audiences I noticed that were actually really growing were like the Philippines, India, UK and Canada have been really big. And I'm like, wow, okay. Somehow people have picked up on this and keep listening over and over again. And yeah, I think it's awesome. I love it because I think these bands are amazing, and I'm sure they're doing most of the heavy lifting for me. I mean, I just translate the songs and teach the vocabulary. The bands did all the hard work because I think that's what people are mostly coming for is I hope the awesome music. I think it's awesome music. I think there's a lot of really good music out there in the German scene, and I'm just glad that people are responding to it because I mean, I don't think this is something that happens as much in other countries, but America being so sort of insulated from the rest of the world, I don't think it occurs to a lot of people to actually listen to music in other languages that much. And it's something I've always done. I mean, I listen to Arabic music, I listen to Chinese music, Japanese music, Russian music, all of it's good to me. I don't
Yeah.
necessarily have to understand what they're saying. You can usually look up the lyrics, get an idea of what the band's all about, decide from there if that, uh, syncs with your values or whatever. And just kind of, I'm happy just having an idea of what the band's all about, what an idea of what the songs are about, and just enjoying the music from there. And I don't think a lot of people do that. And of course, for languages that I'm actually learning, I spend more time with the music, and I love that, especially watching my own progress over the years, just really go from I would listen to songs and really only understand maybe the chorus at first, and the rest of the song was, not very clear. I might pick up a word or two to the point where I'm at now, where if I hear a new song in German, I can 9 times out of 10 understand every word the first time. I think people you know, who love music, I think you should absolutely incorporate that as part of your language learning routine. And I think a lot of people do. I just don't think it's something we do here in America as much as we really should.
No, and I'm a huge fan of music from all over the world as well because I mean, not only do I, as a musician, play guitars and all these other instruments, but I also play tambura and I've got sarangi as well, and they're both Indian instruments. And I've got instruments from other countries as well that I try to play to a certain level. Um, and I listen to music from all over the world as well, such as, like I said, India, Africa, and Japan, Germany, France, and all sorts of countries. I think it's nice to do that in a way. But like you said, I mean, even in the UK, I find that when I speak to people about music, a lot of these people that I will speak to, friends and acquaintances, they will be very insular in a way, like you said about America, where it's almost like film as well. Where people will not watch films that are in foreign language. I mean, all you need to do is just put on the subtitles. And I'm a
Right. Yeah.
big fan of Chinese and Japanese films from when I was a kid. The Bruce Lee films and whatever introduced me to that. But I think there is a thing where some people can be very much like that, be very insular and just be, oh, I will only listen to or watch something that's in my language.
Hmm. Yeah, I think people sometimes have a hard time kind of understanding what the point of it would be. And I think that's kind of tragic because I think there's just so much interesting stuff. As you said, film. I love foreign films as well. There's so much more media and content, especially if you learn a second language, that you can consume. And I'm just kind of the person who's always looking for something new to experience and something new to learn about. Um, and so I could not imagine sticking to purely English content with my media. I think I would go nuts from boredom.
Yep.
And so I kind of have a hard time understanding that. But I mean, it's certain, I guess, I mean, there's not really, I suppose, a point for a lot of people, and I think that is tragic. And yeah, I'm not sure if I can find a way to understand that personally, but it's true
No,
for a lot of people.
it's the same as I don't understand people that go on holiday abroad to a foreign country, but they won't try that culture's food or drink. They will only eat and drink what they are used to from their own countries. It's like people from England will go to Spain and they will go to an English bar, for instance, to
Right,
have
right.
that. And I sort of think, well, if you're going to avoid the culture and the food and the drink,
Why'd you
in
go?
essence,
Yeah.
what's the point of actually going there?
Right. And yeah, the thing that I think similar to that, the thing that always baffles me is, people here, if they go abroad, they go as part of a tour.
Hmm.
And I'm like, as an old school backpacker, I have never been on a tour in my life.
Yeah.
I've gone to many countries and I've just struggled through, the language barrier, which is usually easy enough to overcome regardless of where you are. One way or the other, people can understand each other is kind of amazing. Um, and I love that, even though it can be frustrating at times and it can, lead to you getting on the wrong train going in the wrong direction, but you can, easily jump off at the next station and switch platforms and go back if you make that mistake. But I don't understand wanting somebody to lead me around the whole time and show me only what they want to show me. And we only get to stop here for an hour and barely enjoy a thing. Yeah, I don't get the whole tour thing. I like to go somewhere and explore on my time and do exactly what I want to do. And I mean, I like talking to people. I like meeting people from other cultures and other countries. Yeah, I guess I don't understand that whole being herded around by a tour company thing. It's just not me.
No. And if you are on that train, by the way, that's going the wrong way and you get off to change trains, my suggestion there would be change trains a couple of hours later and see what's going on where you've accidentally ended up.
Yeah, yeah, fair enough. That can also be an interesting way to do things.
So
I mean,
what?
some of
Go
the
on.
most interesting stuff I've seen is from recommendations from people from that country.
Yeah.
Um, you know, I've definitely been to at least one or two places in the world that, people are like, you're probably the only American who's ever seen this. I'm like, well, that's kind of cool. Glad I was the only one who was brave enough to come out here, I guess. I don't know. And then I just, want to go home and tell everybody, look at this amazing thing. You should go do this.
So what sort of structure do you have for the show and what sort of research do you do leading up to the recording of the show?
The structure's changed a little bit. Basically, there's kind of three parts and four parts and three iterations of the same song. So I start by introducing the band, and if there is anything, I guess I should back up. So I decided early on that I would end up just playing the same five bands that I like the most if I didn't have a way of randomizing the songs that I introduce each week.
Okay.
So I decided to try to start matching songs up with holidays, for example.
Okay.
So like a Valentine's Day episode coming out in February is going to be a love song. I did something for World Oceans Day, which was a song about sea cucumbers. Um,
Yep.
so I start by talking about whatever holiday or event, historical event, or whatever it is, whatever cultural thing I can come up with to relate the song to. Um, Start by talking about that, start by introducing the song. Then we play the song the first time just so, everybody can kind of get a feel for it. And then come back and I sort of curate about 30 vocabulary words, sometimes a little bit more, sometimes a little bit less. It depends on the song, that I go over so that people can then, when they hear the song the second time, listen out for those vocabulary words. And then I come back after they hear the song the second time and actually just read the lyrics slowly in German and then slowly in English. Sometimes I have guests on to help me with that. Recently put out an episode where a nice gentleman from Cologne um, suggested the song. He talked a lot about the band because he's a fan of them. And he did all the German portions and I did the English portions. And then basically play it a third time. So hopefully by that point, after, hearing the song three times, going over the vocabulary and then going over the lyrics in detail, hopefully you come away understanding all, if not most of it. Um, and if it's still something that, you need a little more time with, then hopefully the person will go back and listen to the song on their own, um, independent of the podcast. And then I put out vocabulary reviews. Used to do that on Twitter. Now I've moved that onto YouTube and Spotify. So it's just like a video that shows the vocabulary words that we went over in the episode so people can review those and then hopefully learn them well, keep listening to the songs. And if you followed in love with the song, which is the whole point of it, if you learn that song, then those are words that when you encounter them in other contexts, be it on a TV show or in a conversation, you instantly get this recognition from that. um that word, and then knowing those words build, like anything else, as you build vocabulary and can understand more, you can pick out new words from context.
Yeah.
So that's basically it. Although I guess the direction I'm going in now, most of the first season is kind of like international observances, sort of. Like I did a Black History Month episode because it's actually observed both in America and in Germany. A lot of the other ones are sort of international observances that are sort of kept track of by the United Nations or whatever. But this season, I'm trying to get it more Germany specific. So this year's Valentine's Day episode will go into more like how marriage and dating works in Germany.
Yeah.
Um, than Valentine's Day. And so the first song of this new episode was by a Berlin band that often sings in the Berlin dialect. So I went into a few examples of the Berlin dialect so that people could, learn a little bit about that. And so, yeah, I'm going to try to continue in that vein for the rest of the season. I don't want to give away a ton of what I have planned, but I think it's going to be a much deeper dive into German history, culture, pop culture, and I hope it'll be really interesting for people.
We're actually going to skip a bit here further down the list of bullet points that we've got because of you mentioning about the artist that you feature.
Mm-hmm.
So, who are the? Because I think this is along similar lines to what I've put the top 5 German artists. So, what are these 5 artists that you've actually chosen as the main artists that you will look at?
Well, I obviously try to do a new artist every episode. It comes out every 2 weeks. So I've, this past year we covered 24 different artists. But back to that point of like, I would probably just get stuck in my 5 favorite artists. And I'm kind of like Flula Borg in this regard, that my top 10 of anything is going to be different from day to day. um Absolutely my top two favorite German bands of all time, and that will never change. Die Ärzte is one, and Die Totenhosen is the other. They're both punk rock bands that have been around for about 40 years now.
Wow.
One is more of a pop punk band, Die Ärzte. They tend to be extremely funny.
Yep.
Um, Wildly inappropriate at times, especially early on in their career. They had a lot of songs that were indexed, which is basically German law. They have to, they kind of restrict it for anybody who's under 18, can't really listen to these songs. They can't
Yep.
be played on the radio, etc. They can't actually, I think they can't even release them on albums to some extent. And
Okay.
they have to have a warning on there and all that stuff. Um, they've mellowed out with time, obviously, over 40 years. Most bands tend to mellow out. And then Die Totenhosen, they've gone in more of a rock direction over the years. They can be occasionally humorous, but I think they tend to be a little more serious with their music. But those are both bands that I absolutely love, and they both have been featured already on the podcast. I'm sure I'll come up with them again. They're probably going to be two of the bands that I will repeat eventually, but I'm trying not to repeat too much immediately. So as for like the rest of the top five, again, this could change by next week. I might have a different three bands, I would say, but Alligator is another one that I have really fallen in love with. He's a rapper. I guess you would call him a conscientious rapper. He tends to rap about social issues like the environment.
Yep.
He does a lot of songs about kind of the dangers of social media and the internet. Seems to be really focused on that a lot. He's just really interesting. He has some very interesting lyrics, really kind of stuff that make you think. And judging from the comment sections, his lyrics tend to get taught in schools. I know I see a lot of stuff in the comment section about, oh, my sociology teacher made us listen to this song. And so he's very interesting as an artist. Broilers is another one that I really, really like. They are kind of a ska punk band. They just have a really good, clean sound. They don't really do bad songs. Just about everything I've listened to them to by them is fantastic. And they actually, their lead singer just recently, I think it was just last week, appeared in a Dropkick Murphys song.
Right.
So I would love, 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 love if the Broilers just broke huge over here. Um, they just don't put out bad music. They just don't. They primarily sing in German, but they did release one English album, and they did do a cover of Cigarettes and Whiskey in English. That's really, really good. Highly recommend them. If I had to pick a fifth, Madsen is another band that I really, really like. I know this is mostly all punk bands or alternative bands, but they're also sort of a punk band, although I'd say they lean a little more alternative, and then they go pretty heavy metal at times. But they're also just a band that doesn't seem to put out bad songs. So I just always find them, fun to listen to. I always enjoy their music, and you know, those are probably some of the best ones, the ones I like the most and listen to the most at the moment.
Well, if people are interested, some people might not realize that some groups that they like, there's quite a few out there that people might not realize that are come from Germany originally. So classic bands that you might not think about would be bands like Tangerine Dream. They're from Germany.
Mm-hmm.
As I mentioned, Kraftwerk, they were from Germany. Dare I say Milli Vanilli, but that's a bad subject nowadays. Boney M,
Yes,
Can,
Boney M, big
yep,
one, big one.
Can were from Germany. Fantastic
Mm-hmm.
progressive band.
Mm-hmm.
And you could just keep going. I'm going through all this entire list, but
Mm-hmm.
these are mostly things that I've got at home actually.
There are a lot of German bands that broke over here singing primarily in English, and people may or may not necessarily know they were from Germany. Most of what I feature on the show are bands that primarily sing in German, and that, is kind of, I don't know if it's been necessarily a barrier to wide international success, but I would imagine it has something to do with it.
So, how do you record and edit the show together?
Just with Audacity, and when I have guests on, tend to just do it as part of a Zoom call for the most part. And yeah,
Wow, quick answer to that.
Audacity is your friend. Yeah, I am very basic with the recording and the editing. I don't know a lot of super special tricks or anything. I haven't been doing it for long. Still in the process of learning. Definitely, probably some pretty rough sounding episodes, especially at the beginning. But, continuous improvement. I'm learning all the time.
We all have to start somewhere.
Mm-hmm, exactly.
And then I like the logo that you've got for the main logo with it almost reminds me of that sort of like that almost is it phrenology or something, that sort of image of that face that they use, with all it reminds me of that, where you've got the different areas shown of the brain. It reminds me of that sort of image that face does, that
Yeah.
you've got on there. Yeah.
I was going for something that looks slightly academic.
Okay.
So I use Canva, Canva,
Yep.
to do most of any art work for the podcast. So all the vocabulary review, I actually go on Canva and do sort of a picture that is related somehow to the content of the song. And then I put the vocabulary words kind of, in big bold letters on those and create a video from it. But yeah, this is like the third logo I've used.
Yep.
I think it looks a heck of a lot better than the first two, but again, it's, process of learning how to use Canva, which is a fantastic, fantastic free service. And you can actually get a pro version, but you can also just kind of pay individually for pro. They have certain images that are free to use and certain images that fall under this pro category. So you can either like pay for just the one image that you use, or you can have a pro account. It's really not expensive, especially if you use just a single image. I think it's like at most $1 for most anything you use. So yeah, I created it in Canva. Just really liked how it looked. The sort of statue head in it, I hope, sort of reflects that this is a learning educational podcast. But at the same time, with the headphones on there, I hope it shows that, it's also not rigidly
It's a
academic.
podcast.
Yeah, it's a podcast. It's not rigidly academic. And, hopefully it projects at least a little sense of fun, because that's kind of also the point, is that this is kind of a more fun way to study vocabulary than just flashcards.
Yeah, it reminds me of, I'm going on a tangent again here very quickly. It reminds me of, I was speaking with a good friend of mine who teaches music for a living at schools. And this is many years ago. I was speaking to them and I said that in some ways, I think that school in England, at least, I think they need to look more at contemporary music in a sense to make it applicable to the pupils that they're teaching. Because if they make what they're teaching close to what they are listening to now in the music world, it makes it more interesting to that person. So if somebody's interested in music as a whole, then your way of looking at this would be closer to, it would hit them where it, you know, where their area is essentially.
I certainly hope so. And that's another reason I kind of randomize the songs as well, because my hope, I listen to what I like. I can listen to music in just about any genre, even if it's a genre I don't like. I can usually at least find a song or two or a couple of artists in that genre that I do like. And so, kind of trying to bear in mind that I'm trying to reach, German learners in general. I include some songs on there that I don't necessarily love or listen to on a regular basis, but I can appreciate them.
Yep.
And so, like, I want to make sure that as many people as possible are catered to in one way or another. So it's a huge variety of music. I mean, it's anything from punk to reggae to pop to R&B to rap, and everything in between. Hopefully, I'm going to get to, I know there's some more styles I'm going to be getting to later, and I'd like to even include some music that's sort of music from comedy based television shows eventually. It's not necessarily, a music artist, but just something that's fun and different and lends the show some variety so that the widest possible audience can enjoy it. I also try to be very intentional about including musicians of color and as even a mix as I can of female and male musicians, just so that there's hopefully something there for everybody.
So what advice would you give to people who are thinking of learning German or any other language?
Um, I guess it depends on why you're learning the language, but if you're just, want to learn a language, fine. And it's not necessarily that you have to because you're moving there. You need to because it's related to your job, although those are perfectly valid and great reasons to learn languages. Find something that you're interested in,
Yep.
find something that sounds good to you. Uh, I think it's important to be interested in the culture somehow. I think that's why, especially like Japanese is so popular here now because anime just blew up in popularity out of nowhere
Yeah.
in the 90s. And what followed from that are a lot of schools now offering Japanese classes that are filling up very rapidly. So find something that you're interested in, something that really, where it doesn't become a chore to keep learning, where you're just like, oh, I can't wait to get home and learn some more French today. It
Yeah.
should, I should hopefully be like that. And also don't limit yourself to, especially if you're sort of learning in a classroom, don't limit yourself to just what you're learning in that classroom. Engage with the language outside of that.
Yeah. That reminds me, it's one of the good things about your show where you actually point out that your show is good for if you're learning the language of German anyway, your show is useful for those people that are learning German to just go that little bit step further. It's like you were saying with that just then. It's like you learn the language in a classroom, but if you then go into other mediums with that language and listen to the music or watch films that are related to that, it pushes it more to you, that language, because you can actually hear it being spoken or sung, and it helps you to develop and understand how that language works better than just in a classroom.
I think there are a lot of other things too. One thing that I keep thinking to myself as I go through this, when I'm researching songs and researching whatever little, historical or cultural thread the song leads me on, a lot of it, a lot of things that you get from consuming, things like stand-up comedy, TV shows, music from other cultures that you don't really get in textbooks. To explain that, I learned German mostly the traditional way in a classroom, and I just thinking back to the textbooks, it was all everything they teach you about the culture is basically beer, pretzels, lederhosen, very typically stereotypical stuff about Germany that if you actually go to the country, you find is not terribly relevant and only applies in certain areas and is certainly not reflective of the overall culture that you run into when you're actually there. And I think that's why it's important to consume content outside of that, because you get a whole different picture of the culture, of the country, of the people by listening to their songs, because they're writing songs for themselves. They're not writing songs for the rest of the world. So they're going to write about what's important to them and what matters to them. And so you're gonna understand that through listening to the music or the TV shows that they make. It's whatever captures their imagination, whatever is important and interesting to them, and then you pick up on that as you watch it as well. And I think that's another reason that it's important to consume some media outside of what you're presented in the classroom, especially some of those textbooks were written an awful long time ago, and you might be on the 10th edition of something that was written in the 1950s. A
Yeah.
lot has changed since then. So yeah, don't limit yourself to the classroom for a lot of reasons. But definitely classroom, and not throwing off on classrooms, I still think is probably one of the best ways to learn anything. But it's just that there's more out there to learn and understand than you're going to get in an hour lecture every day.
Yep, it's the difference between in in English literature, for instance. It's the difference between being in the classroom reading a play, the script to a play,
Mm-hmm.
and going to actually see the play be performed. It's completely different, two different things altogether.
Exactly. Reading Shakespeare and sitting in the Globe and watching a production. Yeah, two different things entirely.
So, what advice would you give to people wanting to make a podcast?
Um, I mean, I stumbled into it, so just stumble into it, I guess. Find somebody. For me, I had to go to a friend of mine and I'm like, please talk me into this. I kind of want to do this but I'm absolutely terrified and I hate public speaking and I hate the idea of putting my voice out there on the internet.
Yeah.
I hate everything about it. Talk me into this. And yeah, he was very supportive and talked me into it. And I'm glad he did. And I'm grateful to him. So, yeah, just find somebody to talk you into it, stumble into it, experiment, mess up. Just
Yeah.
if you want to do it, and don't think that your idea is good or bad, no matter what it is. Do what you're interested in, no matter what. And I guess that doesn't matter whether that results in 5,000 listeners or two. I think if you're passionate about it and you want to talk about it and you want to put it out there so the world can listen to it, I think that's probably more important than anything else.
If you're interested in it, then there will be other people that are interested in it and want to listen to it.
Yeah, I mean, theoretically, absolutely. But I'd say, even if I didn't get that many listens, I think I'd still be perfectly happy with it, to be honest.
Yeah. Same here. So I've not got it on the list. I don't know why I've not got it on the list. What other podcasts do you enjoy listening to now that you're an actual podcast listener?
A lot of them have actually been guests on my podcast. I'm the one of the ones that I think I enjoy the absolute most is Getting Down and Wordy. And it is an etymology podcast, and the two hosts are absolutely wonderful. I've been on their show once, and they've been on my show once, and I'm hoping to have them back again. But what they do is they take a popular music song. They tend to mostly deal with a lot of rap music. They don't play the song on the show, but they will take certain words from the songs and talk about the etymology of those words. And they talk about the bands to some extent, but it's just really well researched. It's really a lot more fun to listen to than it sounds like. And they will say that themselves. You know, you hear etymology podcast and your eyes probably glaze over a little bit, but they really make it fun. It's a joy to listen to, and it's always interesting. So I highly recommend getting down and wordy. Made up movies, I love that. And that's a lot of fun. Anybody can submit an idea to these guys, and they will review the movie as if it were real and they had watched it in another dimension where that movie was actually made.
Right.
It's absolutely hilarious. They're really nice guys, and it's a lot of fun to listen to. Sean with Review It Yourself, I really enjoy his show too.
Yep, you've been on it.
Yeah, and I've been on it, and he's been on mine as well. And I ran into him by suggesting one of the Defend It Yourself movies. You can actually sort of suggest a movie that you like and no one else does, and go on there and, you know, tell the world why you like that movie and why everybody else is wrong. So that's a lot of fun. Haunted Tales, I absolutely adore these two. The husband is a horror writer, and the wife narrates the stories every week, but it's scary stories. And they just do a beautiful job, and they're some of the nicest people you could ever run into. So if you like ghost stories, you like scary stories, it is really a lot of fun to listen to. They do an excellent job. And there's a million more, but I'm sure you only have so much time. So we'll stop with those.
Okay. So where can people find you and get hold of you, Paisley?
Basically only on Spotify. I did start a new podcast that's going to have a lot wider distribution, Learn German Through Lit, where I actually just read passages. I'm starting by reading passages from Grimm's fairy tales in the original language.
Okay.
And go through some vocabulary for that as well. But because of the way Anchor is set up with Spotify, it's basically really only available on Spotify.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Right, well, thank you very much for speaking with me today, Paisley.
Thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. And you can find Pods Like Us on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and TikTok. We do have a Patreon page, which is patreon.com/pods like us, where for just £1 per month you can get some extra shows and other things as well. And you can contact us through podslikeus@gmail.com. Anyway, thank you everyone for listening, and hope you listen again to another episode of Pods Like Us.